Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today, I have the pleasure to be joined by Oscar nominated cinematographer John Schwartzman, who brought us extraordinary visuals shooting films such as Benny and Joon, The Rock, Armageddon, Pearl Harbor, Conspiracy Theory, Seabiscuit, The Rookie, The Amazing Spider Man, Jurassic World, and many, many more. It is my great pleasure to welcome Mr. John Schwartzman.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on my show. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that, John. And at first, I would like to talk about your experience entering the Hollywood scene. I mean, you had done many music videos and you also shot commercials. And how did you experience entering Hollywood and after having done so many commercials and music videos?
Well, I think, I get asked this question a lot by film students, and I go and speak sometimes at my alma mater, the University of Southern California's film school, USC Film School. I happen to just, Michael, be in the right place at the right time. I grew up with Michael Bay. He and my sister went to primary school, junior high school, and high school together. So I've known Michael since probably he was 10 years old. I am 3.5 years older, so I was farther along. And Michael was a great still photographer throughout high school. He had a very good eye. And I went off to USC Film School, and we sort of stayed in touch. We weren't close friends at the time, but he kept an interest in what I was doing because he wanted to get into the film business. I got out of USC Film School and I won what was now the Student Academy Award for cinematography for a picture called The Last Chance Dance, directed by a director named Phil Joannou, who went on to make Hollywood movies. But the thing is that when that happens and you're 25, the agents all surround the director, but they don't really come after the young cinematographer who shot the movie. So here I am, I'm out of film school, I'm 25 years old, and I now need a way to make a living. So I worked on a lot of low budget movies. I did anything I could, whether it was being a PA, an electrician, and worked my way up through the Roger Corman School. Worked on a bunch of movies for Roger Corman. And at that time, Michael Bay was going to an art college called the Art Center College of Design, which is here in Los Angeles, which is one of the 4 or 5 best art schools in America, right there with Pratt and the Rhode Island School of Design. Now, they had a very, very small film program. So unlike USC, if you were a film student at Art Center, you could go outside of the school's student body to recruit people to help you make your projects. So I started shooting Michael's student films in probably 1986. And whereas USC was very much focused on dramatic narrative films, Art Center was really about how to get these students out of school with a calling card, a show reel. So when I was shooting stuff for Michael, we weren't doing short films. We were doing our versions of commercials. And we were emulating what we saw on TV. And we really tried to do super stylish stuff. So by the time Michael got out of Art Center, the music video scene in Los Angeles was exploding. So this is probably now 1987. And he got signed to a sort of young, up-and-coming production company called Propaganda Films. Propaganda Films had another young director there by the name of David Fincher. So Propaganda was sort of it was the go-to place. You had probably at that time, again, which is very early on in the music video world, but you had David Fincher just starting out. You had Michael Bay just starting out. There was another director named Dominic Sena, and I happened to just be in the right place at the right time. Michael signed with Propaganda Films. I was doing a music video a week later that was very stylish. Based on that, David Fincher saw my work with Michael Bay and then asked me to do a Paula Abdul video, which became sort of, I guess now you'd say it went viral. Back then, it ran on MTV 100 times a day. It became so successful. So suddenly I went from being a guy who was pulling cable on low budget horror movies to now one of the top music video DPs in LA. Michael and I and David Fincher and a few other directors that I worked with, Steve Barron and Mark Romanek, we did this for probably 2 years. And then the style of music videos was starting to sort of invade the world of advertising, right? Suddenly these companies like Coca-Cola and Nike were seeing what was going on in the music video world, and they wanted in on it. They wanted that kind of new look, new style. And so then what would happen was we went from music videos to very large budget commercials and I did them with Michael and David Fincher. And one of the other directors that I was working with was an older director by the name of Jeremiah Chechik. And we had a great relationship. And based on that, he actually said, hey, I'm going to do this movie called Benny and Joon, and I would really like you to shoot it. Now, I had not done a movie that had a budget of more than about $400,000. And this was a studio movie. But between Jeremiah and the two producers, they really fought to get me to shoot that movie. They basically went to the studio and said, well, you like Jeremiah's work. Well, this is the guy that's done it. So you should give him his cameraman. And, it was really, again, it was pure luck that these people fought for me. And then obviously once I had done Benny and Joon, I now had which turned out to be a very beautiful movie, and it caught people's attention. And that sort of propelled my career. Now, there was no grand plan, Michael. I mean, this was just, you follow the path as it's unfolding in front of you.
Thank you very much, John. And Benny and Joon, I think, is an extraordinary picture, and I just rewatched that yesterday. These directors are very different. We just talked about Michael Bay, David Fincher, and then Jeremiah Chechik, who also directed National Lampoon's and Christmas Vacation. So
right.
These must be three totally different characters. And of course, Michael and David Fincher are very visual directors. I mean, of course, they can tell a story, no question about that. But the focus also is on the visual aspect of filmmaking, whereas Benny and Joon is more of a character study.
Yes, and I think that, look, as a cinematographer, you have a relationship with a director, and every director is different. And there's no question that with both Michael and David, they're very, very strong visual guys. When you go and you're surveying locations with either Michael or David, you look and you see where they're standing, and you know that's exact. You look at it and you go, that's where I would stand as well, right? They're thinking story through visual storytelling as much as anything else. Jeremiah was very much a character piece, but he gave me, because we'd had a very good relationship doing commercials, where he sort of let me do the photography and design how we would photograph it. So on Benny and Joon, which was really my first movie, he was more hands-off on the lighting and the staging, and sort of, we would talk about it. I'd say, what if we do this and we should move them here? Or how about we shoot Joon against the window in silhouette? Or there's a scene at night where Benny and Joon sort of make love for the first time, and it's at night, and there was a river in the background. And I said to Jeremiah, let me see if I can get a reflection off the water. We'll put a light all the way across the river. And his attitude was fantastic. With Michael, he would come in and say, here's what I want to do. I want ... So not that it wasn't my work, but there was a lot of discussion as to how we were going to light it, how we were going to shoot it. Now, remember, I had done 150 music videos and commercials with Michael. So we spoke the same language. When we went to Alcatraz to look at the famous prison to shoot The Rock, which was all shot on Alcatraz, nothing that takes place in that prison was shot on a studio set. That was all a practical location. there was no arguments between us. We knew how, I mean, he and I would walk around and go, okay, scene 77, we should be here. So it was a real shorthand with Michael, to get those images and to make that movie as stylized as it was something that we both agreed on just in principle from the very beginning.
The films you did with Michael Bay are visually fantastic, and those were probably heavy courses. I mean, we are talking about The Rock, Armageddon, and Pearl Harbor, and especially The Rock means so much to me. I mean, of course, I also like Armageddon and Pearl Harbor a lot, but The Rock to me is one of the quintessential action pictures, not only of the 90s, but of all time. I could probably do an entire interview just talking about The Rock. I mean, just the whole opening of the film, the main title, it's fantastic. I mean, it I think it's one of the greatest main title sequences in the history of action cinema. I mean, everything comes together: the look, the lighting, cinematography, the music. It's just fantastic. I think it's one of the seminal action pictures.
Well, it's funny. Obviously, I shot it, and I have it's very close to my heart. It runs still consistently on HBO, Showtime, all of the cable networks here, and it still holds up. And what I remember about making it was, Michael and I had the decision that we were going to shoot this in a stylized, almost commercial advertising way. We were going to move the camera with what we really wanted was to create something that no one had really seen before in a traditional action movie. We wanted to utilize the tricks that we had learned through 2.5 or 3 years of music videos and commercials, meaning we used forced perspective sets. We used sometimes super close wide angle lenses. We used every trick in the book. I mean, we put the camera on a skateboard and pushed it down the hallway. We were young. I was 31 years old doing $100 million movie. I mean, that rarely happens. Michael was 28. I mean, I can remember we were standing on a street in San Francisco and we looked at each other and it was like, I can't believe they gave us all this money to do it. And the whole thing we were trying to do was just do something different in terms of lighting and making it stylized and all of that. That was the easy part of it. And we knew what we were going to do. It was going to be a lot of backlight, smoke. These were things we wanted the movie to have a real graphic nature to it and to sort of really pop in almost a three-dimensional way that obviously films it is taking a three-dimensional world and putting it into a two-dimensional media, but we really wanted it to have that kind of pop and muscularity, and I think we succeeded.
Yeah. And the film holds up very well. I mean, I think I've watched it like at least 50 times throughout my lifetime, and there are so many standout scenes, and especially what I love about this film and about this period of action filmmaking or filmmaking in general is that CGI was not available, or at least it was very expensive. It was in its infancy. I think in 95, 96, it didn't even exist yet. So there are so many practical effects in this film, and most of it, I think, was shot in camera, right?
It was all, yeah. I mean, the reality was, so we made that movie in 94. And there was no CG. There's not one blue screen shot in the movie. Now there was blue screen, but you'd have to go out and shoot a background. For instance, when you're seeing the fighter pilot, that was a mock-up of a plane, and then the jets that are outside behind the fighter pilot are 3-foot models that we hung off of a forklift, and they're just on wire. This was all done in camera. When Sean Connery is sitting there in the interrogation room and there's a cup of coffee in the foreground, that coffee mug is 2.5 feet high because Michael wanted it to be super big in the foreground. That's what I mean by forced perspective. And so we were we were utilizing the things that everyone has utilized. I mean, Charlie Chaplin used to do this. All you have to do is look at modern times. But a lot of these things weren't really being used anymore in film. And we were sort of like, you know what? Let's break the rules. We can put little cars way in the background and they'll be out of focus and you'll never know that they're 2 feet, they're only 2 feet, long. We had a lot of fun trying to play with photographic tricks on that movie. And I think it really holds up. And also, Armageddon has no CGI in it. Actually, it does have a little CG, but in Armageddon, all the two space shuttles were miniatures, right? So I had a whole miniature unit shooting on another studio with a motion control camera with the Freedom and the Independence, and those were like 6-foot models. When the space shuttle lands at NASA and you see everybody running towards camera, that's a 10-foot recreation of the space shuttle. We built what we call a bigature. It's not a miniature, but it obviously wasn't a full-size space shuttle, And then it's just a case of understanding how to use the lenses to make that look believable.
Yeah, and it's so amazing. I think on Armageddon they gave you even more money. I think The Rock was about $80 million, and
Yeah, I think The Rock was was 78 million. And obviously it made 600 or 700 million dollars. Armageddon was the longest movie that I've ever been on in terms of from start to finish. I think we shot 130 days. And part of that was, as the studio saw what we were doing, they actually gave us more money to make the movie even bigger. So it kept growing and growing. But part of what made Armageddon such a long period was we had to work around the NASA schedule for when they were going to film, when they were going to launch space shuttles. So the first space shuttle launch we shot was a daytime launch, and I had to go to NASA for about 8 weeks to figure out where I could put cameras and how we could turn them on remotely, because once they start to fill the rockets with fuel, no one is allowed within a 3-mile perimeter of the launch pad. So the cameras had to go out and sit for 3 days, plugged into the NASA launch computer, with the hopes that on the day they would actually turn on. So that required putting cameras in the parking lot of Panavision for a week, finding out that the batteries wouldn't last, having to have Panavision build us special batteries, then finding out that between day and night the lenses would fog up, so we had to wrap the lenses in Christmas tree light bulbs, plug those into other batteries to keep the condensation from getting inside the lenses, just to get to the point where I could get the 17 cameras to film the day launch, which was never supposed to be in the movie. It was just supposed to be a dress rehearsal, because what we really wanted was the night launch. That was probably 4 months of just prep work, going back and forth from LA to Cape Kennedy and working it out with the people at NASA, who were incredibly lovely, very much behind the movie, because it was kind of a love letter to the American space program.
Thank you very much, John. And what so many people oftentimes don't realize is the effort of filmmaking and the detail of filmmaking. I remember, I think Michael said it during the audio commentary of Armageddon, that they spent almost 1.5 or $2 billion on the look of the spacesuits, and they needed to have a proper look which could look good on camera. Do you remember that?
Yes. Well, we spent a lot of money on the spacesuits. Also, again, so if you were to make Armageddon today, the space helmets would not have had the glass face shields on, right? You would have put that in later in post, because it would have made it easier to record dialogue. You wouldn't have had to deal with any kind of fogging problems. The other thing was they needed to be optically pure, so that they didn't defocus Bruce Willis or Ben Affleck's face when you shot through them with a camera lens. So ultimately, the face shields were made by the same company that makes the face shields for the NASA spacesuits. Each one of those face shields was $25,000, right? So these suits were very expensive. But the first day we went out to film with them, the fan system inside was very loud, so the audio was very difficult to record, and the helmets, the actors were not getting enough oxygen. So at one point, Ben Affleck almost took a rock and tried to smash open his helmet because he couldn't breathe, and he couldn't take the thing on or off. It took two people to take the helmet off. So this was a learning process, to say the least, to get them right.
Armageddon, I think, also holds up very well. And what I love about Armageddon, especially, is the first hour of the film. Introducing the characters and the whole training. Getting them ready for the mission. What I also found especially interesting is that this film also established Michael's, let's say, tendency for really fast-paced cinema. I mean, The Rock had some precursors of what he wants to do and what he became known for, but I think, let's say, the whole scene up to the explosion of the mirror when they meet Peter Stormare, that's very fast and almost how do I put this, a sensory overload.
Yeah, well, I think, no, I mean, actually, so whether you perceived it that way or not, The Rock, I think, actually has more cuts per reel than Armageddon. And I know this because these movies were done traditionally where they were printed photochemically. And the way the labs would do that is they would have two rolls of film called the A roll and the B roll. And the A roll would and in between each cut was black. So you'd run the A roll through the machine, then you would load up the B roll, and it would fill in the spots that were black. The Rock actually had to go to a C roll because the machines couldn't handle cuts that were less than about a foot long. So there was so much cutting in The Rock, and I remember the lab complaining to me that, oh my God, we've never done a C roll before. So I'm sure they had to do it as well on Armageddon. But yes, Michael. But the quick cutting comes from our background in commercials, where we were trying to cram as much into 30 seconds as you possibly could, right? A lot of production value, a lot of big shots that move very quickly because he wants to get the whole shot in there. And then obviously, as his styles evolve, he cuts in and out of these moves a lot more than he used to.
The Rock, for instance, the chase through San Francisco also stands out. Didn't this sequence or scene pose a specific challenge for you and Michael, also due to, setting it up and the pace and, let's say, Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage's involvement?
Well, so here's the interesting part. So a lot of that chase was actually shot in Los Angeles. Some of it was shot in San Francisco. But Sean Connery refused to be in a car that was being towed, right? So part of why that scene became so cutty was we had to shoot Sean Connery on top of a parking lot in downtown LA. And I flashed lights and mirrors, and we shook the camera, and we did those zooms by hand because the car actually wasn't moving. And once we started doing that with Sean, we did the same thing with Nick. Now, there are wider shots where you see the cars race through the streets, but anything that you see Sean Connery or Nick Cage in is what we would call poor man's process work. They're just sitting there in a car that somebody's bouncing up and down with their hands. Michael, a lot of times, is operating the camera. I'm shaking the camera, and the grips and the electricians are flashing mirrors and trying to get lens flares. Anything we could do to kind of give us a cut point, because you could only stay on those shots for a certain period of time before you'd realize, wow, I'm not seeing any background moving out the window. That was just a case where, we just had to be very creative, because basically we were setting all this up, and Sean said, well, I'm not doing that. And you can't argue with Sean Connery, right? So it was like, okay, well, how are we going to solve this problem? And Michael and I put our heads together, and we said, okay, we got an idea. And obviously, if you're not towing somebody through the streets of Los Angeles, where you don't need a lot of police officers to shut the street down, you can also work much more quickly. So in the end of the day, it turned out to be a great solution to a problem that normally you don't have, but we did in this case. Now, in today's world, we would have done this in an LED volume, right? I could have projected the backgrounds on a big LED screen, which is what's happening a lot now. I actually still think, in my mind, if you can go out with a car with cameras on it, it does look better. You get the happy accidents. You get the car going through a pothole in the street and banging the camera in a way that you just didn't predict. And sometimes the actors react to that. But, those are very expensive, very slow ways to do it. Now, back in 1994, other than going onto the roof of a parking structure in downtown Los Angeles, you normally just towed the car through the street.
Yeah, amazing. And watching the film, one wouldn't necessarily notice that you had to do it this way, and that's the magic of cinema. And it just looks fantastic. Yeah, and the whole build to the car chase when they're in the hotel, and then John Spencer gets thrown off of the banister, and fantastic pacing also. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was, and that, again, Michael's very much about, if he can, he wants to shoot in practical locations because there's a reality that the actors also embrace. And, John Spencer didn't like hanging off the 12th floor of the Mark Hopkins Hotel, or the Fairmont, I think it was, but, it was safe. We did it. It was, look, we were young and we didn't know any better. And this was the only way that we knew how to make movies. So the thing was that in the beginning, the first few weeks on Alcatraz, Sean was he was getting more and more difficult every day because Michael works in a very fast, frenetic way. Right now, I'm used to it because I had done, like I said, 150, 200 commercials and music videos, so I knew what to expect. Sean was 68 years old. He was sort of like, "What's going on here? What do you mean just run down the hallway?" Sean liked to do things by the book. I want to rehearse. I want to do this. And Michael liked to just throw everybody in and sort of shoot his way out. So it was getting to the point where you could tell he was not a happy guy, and you don't want to have Sean unhappy. He's a big, kind of scary guy. I mean, I was terrified of him the whole movie. So Jerry Bruckheimer, our brilliant producer and one of the great producers and greatest people I've ever worked with, had Richard Francis Bruce, who had cut The Road Warrior and Seven for David Fincher, who was cutting The Rock. He was in San Francisco cutting the movie with us. And he had Richard put together what we call a little 7-minute sizzle reel, like a highlight reel of everything we had done up to now. And Michael, Jerry, Sean, and I went to a screening room in San Francisco. And I was sitting next to Michael, and Sean was sitting behind me, and Jerry was sitting next to Sean. And they ran this sizzle reel. And about 2 minutes into it, I feel these very large hands starting to rub my shoulders, like he's giving me a shoulder massage. And it's Sean. And what I could see and sense was that maybe the style in which we were making this movie was not something that Sean was particularly comfortable with, but what he was seeing on the screen, he loved, right? So after that moment, everything got a lot easier. It didn't mean that Sean didn't want to slow things down and Michael wanted to go, go, go. But Sean also was smart enough to know that this kid was doing something really extraordinary and he wasn't going to get in the way of it.
And would you say of all the films you've done with Michael, that Pearl Harbor might even have been the most ambitious one and difficult one?
They're all ambitious and they're all difficult and they're all like your kids. Once they're over, that's all fantastic. Pearl Harbor was very long. It was difficult and at times a little bit, scary, dangerous not because Michael put us into dangerous situations, but when you're filming and these airplanes are taxiing all around you and you're moving quickly, you forget that the propellers, when they're spinning, you can't see them. So every day my fear was that somebody, whether it was on my crew or a costume person who was going to walk across to do something to one of the actors was not going to see a propeller and potentially walk into one. And so it was, while we were in Hawaii, I had a lot of anxiety about somebody getting injured. Now, actually, nobody ever did, and it was great. But it was a wonderful canvas to paint on. I mean, the thing about Michael is you show up in the morning and you know that you're not going to make bad shots, right? You're going to, you get there in the morning and you're standing there and Michael walks over and he knows I'm standing where he wants the camera. The question is, what lens and how much track do we want to lay down? And we're good to go. I mean, with Michael, we have so in the movie business, you get what's called a call sheet. It tells you what you're going to do the next day at work. It tells you what time you're going to show up. If we had a 8:00 call in Hawaii at Ford Island, which is where Pearl Harbor is, those cameras were turning over by 8:20 in the morning. We move very fast. We did about 39 shots a day on Pearl Harbor. So, and that's in a 12-hour day with an hour for lunch. So 11 hours, that's like 4 shots an hour.
Not bad.
No, it's exhausting, but it's very rewarding as well.
Great. And I know that you and Michael go way back, and you are the only cinematographer to have worked with him on 3 films, much less 3 consecutive films. How would you describe the filmmaking approach of Michael Bay? And you don't have to go into detail, but as I understand, Michael does have a certain reputation in the business for being rather, maybe not the most sensitive guy. If that's.
I see. But the thing is, I think Michael, that's the Michael after. So Michael and I did 3 movies together, and the reason why I didn't do another movie with Michael, although I still did commercials with him, was by the time I finished Pearl Harbor, I kind of felt like in some ways, stylistically, we were making the same movie, different place, different time period. And with Michael and I, we go back so far that was never an issue. Yes, he always wanted me to go faster, and I go very fast, but I didn't have those issues. Michael, I think, has gotten less patient over time, but certainly that was never my experience with Michael. The reality was that I had finished Pearl Harbor, and then I got offered a small movie called The Rookie with John Lee Hancock, who was a friend of mine. That was a little baseball movie, and all I wanted to do after I finished Pearl Harbor was do something very small and intimate. And I remember the studio, which was Disney, that did Pearl Harbor, said to me, "We don't think you can do this movie. There's not enough money. This is a 40-day shoot. You've got $10 million. And my response to the studio was, I'm a cinematographer. I can do anything. Give me the chance to show you that I can also do a small, intimate movie. And the process on The Rookie, because we were so small, was very much like Benny and Joon, which was we'd show up in the morning, we would rehearse, we would talk about what we were going to do, and we filmed all day, and we went home. And I thought we made a great movie. And it was really this beautiful kind of, heartfelt story. I thought it looked really pretty. And every day was a joy. And then based on The Rookie, I got sent the script for Seabiscuit. Now, I had read the book. It was a best-selling book. So I wasn't going to turn that down. Now, Michael had called me to do, I believe it was The Island, but I wasn't available. I had suddenly sort of gone a different path. I was sort of done with the big action movies because also I didn't want to get typecast into just being the guy who does big movies like Transformers or Godzilla. There were other stories I wanted to tell. And again, not unlike how my career started, I got the opportunity to do The Rookie, which was very small. And that, based on that, Gary Ross saw that movie with his son and called me to do Seabiscuit. So it was like I was going through one door and slightly closing it, but I wasn't going to slam it shut But suddenly all these other doors opened up. I was just, again, I've been very, very fortunate. There's been no great plan. I don't say to my agent, I'm done with action movies, find me something else. It's just a case of the opportunities presented themselves, Michael. Like, that's the best way I can describe it. I would love to tell you that I'm really a genius and I planned this all out, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, and that's very interesting because that would have been one of my follow-up questions: how to avoid getting typecast. I mean, it's fairly easy to be typecast. You know, all of a sudden you're the action guy, you're the rom-com guy, the thriller guy, the horror guy, and your filmography is very versatile, and that's a huge plus. I mean, we are talking about so many different movies. I mean, Conspiracy Theory, which is one of my favorites of the 90s, it is so much different from The Rock or Armageddon because it's a very intimate film. Of course, it also moves at a certain pace at times, but I think Richard Donner, the director, has a very story-driven approach, which makes it especially interesting for you, perhaps.
Yeah, and again, this is one of those things where Richard Donner hired me because he had seen The Rock, and I think Dick's producers had said, you know, all these other cinematographers who you've worked with are great, but we think you need some young blood. So here I am. I'm 34 years old. Dick hires me to shoot Conspiracy Theory. Obviously, he's not Michael Bay. I'm not going to shoot Conspiracy Theory like The Rock, but I'm also going to bring my sensibilities to it. The script was written by my friend Brian Helgeland, who I went to college with. So it was a plus plus. And I loved Dick, and Dick was very open, and he wanted to have a movie that looked different than what he did in the past. And I think, again, I would read the script. We would talk about locations. I would say to him, I think this would be a good way to stage it. And he'd go, okay, kid, do it. You know, I remember the very first shot that we did on Conspiracy Theory. I had lit up like 17 blocks of Riverside Drive in New York. I had brought in major lighting trucks. This was a very expensive night exterior. And it was Mel Gibson sitting in a taxi cab looking at Julia Roberts jogging in an apartment on her treadmill. And the camera was behind Mel Gibson's head, and he was in silhouette. And the only other piece of coverage was a clean point of view of Julia with the window in the foreground. It was all done on location. And I said to Dick, the first dailies the studios are going to see of Mel Gibson, who they just paid $15 million to, is the silhouette back of his head. Am I going to get fired? And he said, don't worry about it, kid. If they don't like it, we'll come back and do it again tomorrow. And to get that kind of confidence from a director as a young cameraman who's basically saying, kid, I hired you to help me tell the story the way you think it should be told. I don't know how, it's just pure karmic luck,
Yeah, amazing. Thank you very much, John. And of course, there is a limitation to storytelling and to camera equipment and to technical equipment and so on. How did you create the John Schwartzman look? Respectively, how do you adapt to so many different stories, different filmmakers, of course, being a master storyteller yourself?
It's very funny. That's a very hard question to answer. Here's what I would say to you, Michael. If you handed me the screenplay for The Rock today, and I went out to go shoot it with whoever it was, I don't think I would make the same movie today because I'm just not that person. It's hard to separate the person who I was at the time that I was making the movie from the style of the movie. So my lighting styles have evolved as I've gotten older, as I've seen more and more films, as I've watched my peers work who I really admire. So I don't know if I really have a style per se. I mean, certainly The Rock, Armageddon, and Pearl Harbor are muscular, very lensy, very contrasty, strongly lit. You know where in the frame to look. There's no question as to, oh, I want you to look to the left or the right or whatever it is. The use of both highlights and shadows. I did that in a very strong, very theatrical way. No one would say that those movies look naturalistic, right? That was never the style. Even with Kate Beckinsale outside in Pearl Harbor, I wanted to make sure that she was the most beautiful woman you had ever seen, right? So I took care of her, and there would be a warm backlight or whatever it was. So that was very much, we were going for a stylized reality. As I look now, as I've gone farther in my career, I'm not afraid to embrace more of a normal, realistic look. When we first started shooting The Rookie, which is about this high school in a really kind of poor part of Texas, our plan was to always shoot the baseball games in the late afternoon when the light would be nice and warm and pretty. And we did that the first day, and I remember turning to the director and saying, this stuff looks too pretty. No one's going to believe that this town is as crappy as it is. We need to shoot baseball between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon when the sun is directly overhead and the shadows are really hard and you can barely see the baseball players' faces under their hats. And once we made that change and the baseball field looked all washed out, you had more empathy for these kids in this town that seemed like a dead-end town versus it looking like, Days of Heaven, where it was all late afternoon backlight. So, it's a case of just trying to have a style that works for the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah. And The Rookie is a great example. And I think John Lee Hancock is a very interesting filmmaker and director. I mean, I've also watched all of his films, and there are certain ones that stand out. I mean, The Founder, for instance, which I love. And I think Michael Keaton is especially great at playing characters that are ambivalent. I mean, you want to at times root for him, but on the other hand, he's a very ruthless guy and at times asshole-ish.
That was the beauty of that script. You didn't know whether you wanted to hate him or like him, and I really do like that movie. And that movie, unfortunately, got kind of caught up in the whole Weinstein debacle, right? So the movie did get released, but kind of got shelved. But I always felt it was a much better movie and it deserved a wider audience. And, Michael Keaton is just a brilliant actor to work with. There is a relationship that cinematographers have with their actors, or it's something that I like to make sure that I develop. I have my stepmother is an actress. She starred in the movie on your wall behind you, Rocky. Yep. My brother, Jason, is an actor who was in Saving Mr. Banks. And Nick Cage is my cousin. So I'm familiar with actors. I'm familiar with their process. So as a cinematographer, if you can be sympathetic to that and understand it, the process of doing your job becomes so much more rewarding, to be not just somebody who's trying to put out fires, but somebody who's actually engaged with them in finding the right way to both block the scene and tell the story, is really that's what makes the job really fun on a day-to-day basis.
And what I also find striking about your career is that you have the ability to go from a quote-unquote fancy-looking film to a very dark film or dark-ish film. When you worked with John Lee on The Little Things, for instance, or Mr. Harrigan's Phone, both are very concise pictures. Nothing fancy about those, straightforward, dark-ish, and I'm sure they required a certain sensibility.
They do. And what I would say is that, working with John Lee, he's a very precise filmmaker. I would say to you, I think I've done 6 or 7 movies with John Lee. There are probably only 6 or 7 shots that we've made on all of those movies that didn't end up in the movie. John Lee is a very specific filmmaker. He's very much, he loves the early work of Alan Pakula, like Clute and Parallax View and All the President's Men. So with John, I'm very careful about having the camera not call attention to itself unless it's very much supposed to. And he's with Michael will throw 5 cameras at it and blow stuff up, and just he's looking to see, he knows he's going to get a lot of great stuff, and there's going to be a lot of stuff that he's not going to use. With John Lee, you don't turn the camera on until you know exactly what it is that you're doing, and this is the shot, right? So he's a very precise filmmaker. It's a different style of working. They're all fun, but I know when I work with John Lee, this is what we're going to do. I had the script for The Little Things for 22 years. I mean, we were supposed to do that right after The Rookie. It just never happened. So, it was great to get to do it. And it was a very dark story. And we tried to tell, so it required that it be shot in a dark way.
I forgot to mention Saving Mr. Banks, which I think is one of John Lee's best and sweetest films. And of course, it has a stellar cast.
Yes, that was absolutely probably the most joyous experience I've ever had making a movie. And that was partially because we had Richard Sherman, the composer of all that music, on set every day, playing the piano, playing all the songs from Mary Poppins while we moved the camera around. I mean, there were times I'd have to say to Dick, hey, can you just stop playing for 5 minutes? We're going to go do this shot now of Emma. It was just a joy. And you get to work with Tom Hanks, you get to work with Emma Thompson, you get to work with Paul Giamatti, you get to work with Jason Schwartzman, you get to work with, that whole cast. And it's just a joy.
Yeah, absolutely. I bet it is, and thank you very much for elaborating on that. And you've worked with so many filmmakers, and I also need to mention, of course, Paul Feig. And I rewatched the film called A Simple Favor, which I think is a tremendous thriller. It wasn't a blockbuster in the sense of that's, half of the population watched it, but I think it deserves more attention than it received, because I think in terms of acting, in terms of cinematography, and in terms of storytelling, it was a very engaging film, to say the least.
It was. So Paul and I were partners at USC Film School, right? So I had known Paul. We went to school together in 1982, but our schedules never worked out that we could do movies together. He would call me for Bridesmaids. He would always call me. And for whatever reason, he sent me Simple Favor. And I read the script and I thought, wow, this is kind of different. And I said yes. And it was a very small budget movie. We shot it in 8 weeks or less, and with a great cast. And I remember Paul saying to me, I said, because Paul is not, he doesn't come at it visually. He just wants to get in the room with the actors and really coerce the nuance out of every moment, right? Which is great. And he's an amazing director at that. And his only remark to me was, I want this movie to be urban noir. And I sort of said, what does that mean? And as I went scouting with the production designer, I kept saying to them, no, this house isn't going to work. This house isn't going to work. This house. And they were getting very frustrated with me. I didn't know what the house was supposed to be. And then all of a sudden we walked in and I saw this house, and it was very rectangular, rectilinear, lots of verticals and horizontals. And I just said, this is the house. This is the urban noir, right? And then, you put those two ladies in the room in a scene and it's fireworks. So I happen to really love that movie. And the picture that I'm going to go do in February is Simple Favor Part 2, because that movie actually did do very well. It made over $100 million. I think it cost about $30 million to make. So we're doing Part 2 of that next year.
Certain films, you just notice they're good. And of course, many stories are so intriguing that you either go, well, I can't wait how this will turn out and how this story will unfold, or when I'm done watching, I hope there will be a sequel of some sort. And I'm glad that that you brought up the sequel, because I think it's gonna be fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait. I mean, look, so there was a Jonathan Demme movie that was kind of my personal inspiration for Simple Favor, which was this Jonathan Demme movie called Something Wild. I don't know if you remember that movie, but I think it's a
Yeah.
masterpiece. But not that Simple Favor is something wild, but it was the tone of that movie and how things kind of reveal themselves in unexpected ways, and this kind of menace. Now, obviously, Something Wild has more real physical menace in it than Simple Favor, but I kept that. That was my on weekends. Sometimes I would pull it up on my computer and watch it just from a tonal standpoint.
Yeah. Thank you, John. And I would briefly like to talk about the Amazing Spider-Man, if we still have some time left. You had shot it. Mark Webb was the director, and this was a different kind of Spider-Man. I know they had plans to do Spider-Man Part 4, but that kind of never happened, and then they made the reboot called The Amazing Spider-Man. Sam Raimi directed the first 3 Spider-Man films. They were more colorful than The Amazing Spider-Man, and I love that movie. And would you say that a young director or a quote-unquote inexperienced director is more open towards suggestions, or does have a certain sensibility or sensitivity that other directors may not have because they have been a part of the industry for too long?
I think look, all the directors that I've worked with are open to suggestions. I think in the case of both Mark Webb and Colin Trevorrow, who were both essentially second-time directors when I worked with them, they're very strong directors. Now, the Mark Webb loves Armageddon. I think that's why he hired me, right? He just happened to told me, I love this movie. Now, when we were first starting to do The Amazing Spider-Man, Mark Webb said to me, we're going to make the French Connection. We're going to make Spider-Man like we're making I want to make this movie like William Friedkin made the French Connection. I want this movie to be gritty and da 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 da. We were going to shoot an anamorphic film. It was going to be a real, get out there and do it. Suddenly, Avatar comes out. 3D is the rage. And basically, Sony says to us, you know what? That's not what you're doing. You got to go back and rethink this whole movie, and you're going to shoot it in 3D. So that was my first foray into using digital cameras. So, for both Mark and I, we embraced the idea of, okay, so we're going to do 3D. Okay, how do we do this? Oh, by the way, Spider-Man might be the right movie to do real native 3D. So we had the big 3D rigs, the 2 cameras and the mirror and the whole thing. It's a lot of stuff. You don't just show up and start shooting. There's a lot of cables, computers, and wires and all that to make it work. But I think we did a really good job considering the technology that we were up against. It was not the movie that we originally had set out to make in the way that we thought we were going to do it. That said, I think we made an interesting movie. And then I was going to say, Colin Trevorrow, who I did Jurassic World with, was very, very much a specific director. So we're doing Jurassic World, and I've got a very large budget. I've got a big camera department. I've got multiple cameras. And Colin would only use one camera. He was like John Lee Hancock. No, I don't need a second camera. Colin did not. I would say to Colin things like, okay, if we want to shoot this scene over here, we need to do this in the afternoon when the sun's behind the big banyan tree or whatever it is. And he'd say, okay, great. But he was very much, he knew how he wanted to stage it. He knew how he wanted to cover it. Yes, we discussed it a lot in terms of just the mechanics of how to get it done, because a lot of times you're in the mud, in the jungle, and what's the right tool and what's the right device. But there was no way that I was going to ever convince him to put a second camera on a sequence if he didn't want it. Although he was a very inexperienced director in terms of credits, he wasn't in terms of being a director. So that's a long answer to your question, that they're inexperienced in that they don't have the big blockbuster $200 million budgets on their IMDb page. But they also got these jobs because they're very smart. They're clever filmmakers. They are very good with actors. Actors love working with them. And, they make good movies.
Yes, absolutely. And I think many filmmakers are misunderstood to a certain degree. And I always hate it when people get pigeonholed and here is David Fincher or Michael Bay. They have a commercial background or they come from the world of music videos, and therefore everything is style over substance. That's not necessarily true, because everybody has to start somewhere, and nobody gives you $200 million if you're inexperienced as well. Go ahead and make my movie. You need to have a track record, and sometimes criticism is just preposterous.
Well, and obviously, Michael, the reason why myself or Sal Tatino or John Toll get hired with these younger directors is not to direct the movie for them, because I'm not a director, but is to help them not go down the wrong path, right? To get in trouble, to guide them into how to best tell the story that they want to take, right? Because I have a lot of experience and I can see where, this might be difficult if we do it this way. Can I propose something that will achieve the same thing in a way that I think you're going to be more comfortable doing? And that's what the experience has taught me. Not to say, no, this is not the way to do it. It's to say, okay, this is what you want to do. Here are 3 different ways we can do it. This is the best way. I think it's going to give you the most time with the actors. This is another way to do it, but it's going to be more time intensive. You tell me which way you want to go.
We previously talked about Jerry Bruckheimer also, and you also worked on National Treasure, the Book of Secrets, and you co-DP'd this one with Amir Mokri. And how did you divide the work on that one?
Well, so what happened was, and again, the director John Turteltaub and I went to film school together. Amir had to leave that movie early. So basically, Amir had prepped the movie, and he shot the first 3 weeks of the movie and then had a family emergency and had to leave. Now, it just so happened that both Amir and I used the same crew. We had the same gaffer, the same key grip, pretty much the same camera crew. So Jerry called me and said, hey, look, Amir has to leave this picture. Can you come in and take over? And I called Amir and he said it would be great if you could, and that's what happened.
Okay, great.
So we didn't split the work. He shot the stuff in Washington and a few other places, and I came in right when they got to South Dakota, and that's where I took over and then finished the movie. So they had basically only been about 3 weeks into their 15-week filming schedule, but Amir had done about 8 or 10 weeks of prep. So I relied on the fact that we shared the same crew who had prepped the movie, so that basically I was able to kind of step right in without any major problems.
Great. And you also got to shoot on location and at Mount Rushmore, for instance. Do you recall any issues regarding a permit to shoot there? Because as I understand, it can be rather tricky at times to really get the red tape ready.
Well, I don't obviously have to deal with that.
Yeah.
And obviously, when you work with Jerry Bruckheimer, a lot of that red tape goes away. I mean, so just imagine you've got 25 vintage airplanes. They cannot fly from mainland United States to Hawaii. So how do you get those airplanes to Hawaii? If you're Jerry Bruckheimer, you call up the US Navy, they put them on an aircraft carrier, and they sail them from San Diego to Honolulu for you, right? So on Pearl Harbor, there was a day where the John C. Stennis, one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world, pulled into Pearl Harbor with 25 vintage airplanes on the flight deck. Not F-16s or F-14s, but B-25s, P-40s, Zeros, Vales, Kates. That's how that happens. You don't get a permit to shoot. I mean, you don't get to climb inside the space shuttle like I did without Jerry Bruckheimer making a call to NASA. You don't get full access to the Alcatraz prison, which is a national park, without somebody like Jerry Bruckheimer. So the answer to your red tape is make a movie with Jerry Bruckheimer. There is no red tape.
Yes, I mean, I get that so many times that Jerry is such a hands-on producer and such a well-connected producer. I mean, I also heard that, when Deep Impact came out the same year as Armageddon, that they did not have the same access as you did because also of Jerry Bruckheimer's connection to the government and so on, to the Navy and so on. So that is a major plus.
That was the crown that we had, right? I mean, we got to film 2 shuttle launches. We got to go into the underwater tank. That's really Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck in a tank in spacesuits with 6 real astronauts. I mean, we had access to everything, that. And I remember because Deep Impact and Armageddon were shooting at the same time. And I would go to the lab in the morning. I didn't tell anybody this, but I would see the Deep Impact rushes before I would watch the Armageddon rushes. And I would report back to Michael and tell him, look, you don't have to worry. They're not making the same movie as us.
That's interesting. And of course, it's not the same movie. No, absolutely not. These are, despite the similar subject matter, these are different films. Yeah. Needless to say. Yeah. John, do you have to run it, or could we continue for a couple of minutes?
We can go. We can still go.
John, how would you describe your career path as a cinematographer, and the evolution of your own work?
Wow, that's a difficult question. I mean, I think part of it is that your work matures as you mature. I mean, when I started as a cinematographer, I was unmarried. I now have a granddaughter. So, life has its influences on all of us as to how we see the world. And as I said to you earlier, Michael, I don't know if I would, I know for a fact that if I shot The Rock today, it would be a different movie than it was when I shot it in 1994. Could I go back and copy what I did? Sure. But I think if I read that script today, I might have a different take on it. I'm not saying it would be better or worse, because I don't know how I could do a better job than I did on The Rock, but I just know that I'm not that same cinematographer. I don't know if that really answers your question, but every movie is a new journey, and I'm always looking for new ways to tell the story. Now, every cinematographer will tell you the same thing, which is you plan your shoot and you try to shoot your plan, but every day something's going to happen that's out of your control. And how you deal with it is your success or failure as a cinematographer. Obviously, as you get more and more experience, you know how to get yourself in and out of problems with a little more alacrity, but inevitably you're going to hope for sun and it's going to be raining. And, I'm not on the kind of movies where you say, oh, the weather's bad, let's not shoot today. That no one gets that kind of freedom anymore, right? Sometimes you're lucky if you're at a location and the weather's bad and you can say, oh, let's go inside and do the scene inside right now. And then when the weather gets better, we'll go outside. That happens sometimes. That doesn't happen all the time. So, it's really, you plan and then you just hope that your plan doesn't fall apart.
Yeah,
I mean,
certainly.
a perfect example was when we were shooting in the jungles of Hawaii for Jurassic World. I remember saying to the producer, do I have to shoot if it's cloudy and rainy? Because this whole movie takes place in 12 hours. And he said, absolutely, you have to. So Rafi Sanchez, who was my gaffer, and I, we had so many lights on so many cherry pickers in the jungle. And I remember the line producer, who was a brilliant producer named Pat Crowley. And Pat said to me, don't worry about the lights. I'll be the happiest if you never have to turn them on, meaning that the weather was good. And when you have that kind of support, you know, you do your job.
I think I may have another, I hope, interesting question. How do you balance servicing the story versus servicing the actor's look and performance?
Well, so they're servicing the story and the actor's performance. Those kind of are hand in hand. And I am a big believer in that. I like movie stars to look good. I always take care of my women. The one thing I would say the through line through all of my work is I would say that I try not to like close ups in an unattractive way. Even if I'm trying to, even if it's supposed to be not pretty, I still try to give it some love, right? But I'm not gonna like Charlize in a way that doesn't make her look like Charlize Theron. I mean, that's why she's there, and that's the joy of it. Um, I'm not gonna like Emma Thompson in an unattractive way. I don't want to make it so cosmetic that it takes away from the story, but I also don't want to light somebody where they look unattractive because I am being lazy or something else.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you
And
very much.
obviously, when you film outside, that's the most difficult time during the day, right? Because the light is changing. You may have a scene that in the movie lasts 45 seconds, but it takes 6 hours to do. So you're trying to balance the way you shoot it with where the sun's going to be. And any cinematographer will tell you that day exterior work is the most challenging to maintain consistency.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. And I would like to talk about, or at least briefly talk about, film school versus learning by doing. What do you learn in the trenches, so to speak, that school could never ever teach you?
Well, I think so. I learned a ton about how to use the equipment, how a set is run by both working as an electrician on the Roger Corman movies. I used to do a lot of behind the scenes footage. So I would be on the set of Hook with Steven Spielberg directing. So I was watching how this all goes on. The thing that film school gives you is it gives you a community of people who are your age, who have an enthusiasm to want to make movies, who, if you call on a Saturday and say, hey, you want to go out and shoot a short film tomorrow, you can get 8 or 9 people. Now, granted, you're pretty inexperienced. Now, I happen to have gone to film school with a pretty good sense of photography. I had a color dark room. I could print color. I could develop black and white and print it. I was very, very good with the still camera. So when I went to film school, I understood how the lab worked. Most film students didn't, and most film students at USC wanted to be writer directors. No one really wanted to be a cinematographer. I was the one who did, so that also gave me access to shooting films for the best of the writer directors at USC. That said, as we've all gone on in our careers, I've maintained that friendship. I wouldn't say that I learned how to become a cinematographer at film school. I certainly watched a lot of films. Um, I learned how to become a cinematographer working in the business. The beauty of film school was the camaraderie, making friends who I still work with to this day. It's certainly not a requirement to becoming a filmmaker.
Yeah. And And John, in terms of the schedule, how different is today's environment from, let's say, the days 20 or 30 years ago when it comes to preparation and to post-production? Has it changed for better or worse? Is there more pressure today, or was it easier back then? What do you think?
Well, there was certainly, what I would say to you is there was more prep time back in the day because of the nature of shooting film, which required more light. So you spent more time at locations with your crew discussing the best way to raise the light level so the film could actually see the interior of the bank building or whatever it was you were shooting. So I generally had probably 40% more prep time than I do today. Now, the difference is I probably have more time involved in post-production because of the DI. So the difference is back in the day when we were printing film, because you were taking $80 million and putting it onto, 12,000 feet of negative that was ultimately going to be the length of the movie. That negative was everything. I mean, you were literally taking everything and putting it on a strip of acetate. So when you went to color correct your film photochemically, you tried not to put it into the machine too many times for fear of scratching it, because back in the day, there was no way to really fix a scratch. So on the Rock, I might have done 3 passes to get the color right. Now, whether you shoot on film or shoot digitally, if you shoot on film, the film is scanned to a digital file, not unlike a Photoshop file that comes out of your still camera. And now that it's a digital file, you can move and play with your color correction as much as you want without worrying about going back and destroying your master. So now I'll spend 10 days color correcting, whereas in the past, I might have only spent 3, right? So I have more time, and I can also do things that I couldn't do, right? On the Rock, you couldn't change the value of an exposure in the middle of one shot. The machine didn't do that, right? So you just had to balance the light from inside to outside. Now with digital cameras and digital post-production, we have a lot of tools where we don't have to light the interior to the same brightness because we know that it's there in the digital, it's on the digital negative. I can do a little dissolve as they come through the door, and I can slowly raise the interior lighting. So there are a lot of tools that in some ways can make us a little more lazy, but also allow us to move a lot faster. The beauty of moving more quickly is it's better for the actors. If you asked my stepmom, my cousin Nick, my brother Jason, what's the hardest part about being an actor? They'd say waiting between the takes, right? If you can keep it moving, you're going to get better performances out of actors. So whenever I approach a movie or a location, I'm always thinking about how do I give the director the most time to work on this scene? If I'm spending 3 hours lighting, that's 3 hours that he doesn't have to direct. I may need 3 hours to light it, but that can be, I come in early so that when he shows up with the actors, we're ready to go. I really believe that the most important thing is to give as much time as you can to the director and the actors on the day, because that's where the magic is. No one is going to remember how beautiful the warm backlight was streaming through the window if the scene is shit, right?
Yes, right. Absolutely right. Now, what I also love about your career is the creativity. I mean, you just mentioned The Rock. One of my favorite scenes of The Rock, actually, there are many scenes. First of all, I love the scene when they get Sean Connery out of prison and the camera approaches and there is the key on the chain which drops down, and then you lit Sean Connery's prison cell. You can see all the books, and then they escort him to the outside. That was a beautiful shot. Or especially toward the ending when Nicolas Cage takes the needle, the syringe, and stabs it right through his heart. And then you can see the camera moving a little bit, and you can see the sweat gliding down his face, and then the sun in the background. That's just beautiful. And those are some of the standout shots of that film.
And well, so one of the unique things about The Rock was at the time, Panavision, who we were getting our cameras and lenses from, was developing this lens system called the Fraser lens system, which was used for macro photography. And it was designed as kind of a wildlife camera, like go out and shoot a lizard on a rock. But I saw it and I co-opted it. And that's how we got all of those macro shots. And sometimes when you saw Nick Cage reaching to grab that VX glass ball, that VX glass ball was 20 inches in diameter, right? And the Fraser lens with a 14 mil and brought it very close to the camera. Again, that's what I was getting at with, we were trying to break all the rules that people had done forever. I mean, that they do in The Wizard of Oz. So, we were just young and we were bold. But the scene with Sean Connery, that was shot in the Los Angeles County Prison, which was not open at the time. We were very limited on what we can do. So the reason why you see that light kind of moving around all the time is we weren't allowed to light it. I just had a light in my hand and I'm just moving it across Sean's face as we steady cam backwards with him. I mean, again, some of these things just come out of having to be inventive on the day.
Yeah, and it certainly paid off. I mean, this film is filled with so many great scenes, and I think it is one of the greatest action films, and I think many people echo those sentiments. I think what you pulled off back then is just absolutely astounding. I rewatch this film at least once a year, and it's still. It's a total package.
And the thing to remember, Michael, is, again, this was shot with film cameras in an era where they were not small. So, you put that, everybody was doing it, but you put that into the mix. In today's world, if I had the Sony Venice with a little Rialto head when I did The Rock, oh my God, forget it. We probably would have made people throw up in the first 8 minutes, But what's one of the nice things about digital cinema, and I still prefer the look of film, and the Jurassic World movies were shot on film and actually large format 65 millimeter film, which I really enjoy because I think that the color science of film is still superior to the color science of the digital cameras. That said, there are lots of advantages to the new digital cameras, just in terms of size, sensitivity. I'm not a purist who says, "Oh no, digital's crap." I still happen to think that there are certain colors, there are certain yellows that digital cameras just can't quite capture. The Storaro yellow from The Last Emperor would be very hard to replicate on a digital camera. They just seem to be blind to those wavelengths of light. That said, you stay away from that. You always work to your strengths. That's what I always believe. So maybe that's been the secret to my career, is I try to work to my strengths, not to my weaknesses.
Yeah, that's a good formula. And you mentioned digital filmmaking. I think there are many advantages to digital filmmaking and to the way it's done today, and CGI, for instance. But I think also disadvantages, as I feel as a film buff and as a film lover, that some of the movie magic gets lost along the way due to the excessive use of CGI. Well, obviously, certain films wouldn't exist without CGI because you cannot do it practically. It's just impossible. But to go back to The Rock, for instance, the scene with the cable car when it's about at least 10 feet in the air due to the pressure which comes from underneath, I think in today's world it would be a CGI shot, perhaps.
It would, and that was we built the cable car and we blew it up right there on Russian Hill. There's certain things I think that are hard to do, and weight and gravity. That's a real thing, right? Because just the way it goes up and the way it comes down. obviously the dinosaurs in Jurassic look amazing, right? But also ILM had done that with Spielberg 20 years before we did the reboot with Jurassic World. But I agree with you. I have this sort of saying that I say to people, and I say it in the DI suite as well when I'm color correcting, which is just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And so when we did Seabiscuit, there was you could do blue screen work, but there was really no CGI. So we were very limited because it was a period movie. So we knew that we couldn't pan right or left, because if we panned left, we'd see a modern gasoline station. So that kind of rigor and discipline, I think, is why the movie is so good. If I was doing Seabiscuit today, somebody would say, oh, don't worry about it. We'll just paint that out later. The problem is you're only as good as your worst visual effects shot, right? One bad visual effects shot takes you out of the entire movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm a believer like Michael is, and Michael to this day still does it, which is put as much stuff in front of the camera as you possibly can that's real, right? Now, you get into fights with the visual effects supervisor who says, well, no, let me do it later. The big fights between cinematographers and visual effects supervisors are lens flares. Lens flares, when they have to put a background in, are more difficult for them to deal with. But it's very hard to really create a lens flare in the computer that looks like a lens flare from Armageddon or Pearl Harbor. Those long anamorphic flares. And every lens has a slightly different character. No matter what you do, they never quite, to me, look right. Now, maybe the rest of the viewing public disagrees with me, but this is my craft, It's like having a chef taste something and go, it's good, but it needs a little more salt. I can see the difference.
As great as today's technology is, and the advancements in this field have been tremendous, and sometimes you really have a hard time telling the difference between a practical shot and a CGI shot, but oftentimes it is really obvious, and you cannot replicate, and I said, the look of the film, such as Pearl Harbor or The Rock. It just feels genuine. It feels real. And I've seen so many action movies over the past couple of 5 years, 10 years, and you can tell right away that many of the scenes came right out of the computer.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Michael, one of the realities of Hollywood or the film industry is that I'm not invited to be part of the post-production process until it's time to color correct, right? And at that point, it's almost too late for me to make changes. If these shots have been composited, if there's 1,000 shots that have been done and approved, and then we get into the color correcting and I look at them and I go, well, but this doesn't quite feel right. And it's like you said, most people can't put their finger on exactly what's wrong, but it doesn't feel right. Now, I usually can. I can go, well, there's not enough contrast there. And to undo the work and try to get it right and put it back together is very time consuming. So they don't want to pay me to be around to approve shots. It just doesn't happen anymore, So part of the problem is that most cinematographers don't get to see the visual effects work from their films until they're in the final, literally till the movie is 2 weeks from being done.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, because I guarantee the only person that probably gets to participate in it is Roger Deakins, and that's why if you look at Blade Runner, it does look pretty damn great, right? Because Roger's the guy who'll go, no, what you did looks great, but that's wrong for this scene. You need to desaturate that background. There's too much color here, because he knows what it's supposed to be like in his head, as do I, because I know the intent of what I was doing. That doesn't mean that the person who's putting the background in knows that intent. And unfortunately, it's usually too late to fix it by the time I sit down to do the final color correcting.
It's a difficult process, and but also On films such as The Amazing Spider-Man, which was released, I think, in 2012. I mean, there are many practical shots in that one too, right?
Yeah, there's a ton. And also on that one, Jerome Chen, who was our VFX supervisor at Sony Imageworks, was very gracious. Now, they weren't going to pay me to come in, but he would say, hey, if you're around, why don't you come? And I don't live far from the Sony studios. He'd say, come on down on Thursday. I want to show you some stuff. And he would be, we've put a background into a handheld shot. And I'd look at it and go, yeah, the background needs a little more bump in it or something. So they were very inclusive, you know. The Jurassics, I kind of see them at the very last moment. But then again, it's ILM, who rarely ever lets a bad shot get out of that facility. So I never have an issue with them. But yes, you know, it just, this is the nature of the finances of the film business. And certainly, I think that any cinematographer will tell you that in the world of digital cinema, the role of the cinematographer does not quite get the same respect that it used to when you were shooting on film, because there was a bit of alchemy, right? You looked at a monitor, which was a video assist, that was a little video camera taking an image off of the viewing system inside the camera. So the resolution was very low. It had a kind of almost impressionistic look. And somebody would say to you, is this what it's going to look like? And I'd say, no. It's going to look great. Wait till you see dailies tomorrow. The reality is now you go look at the monitor and that's exactly what it is. And suddenly you're having discussions with four people about why you've made choices, right? Whereas no one ever asked me on Seabiscuit why I lit it that way. You know, you just didn't do that. The cinematographer had the respect of the director and the crew and the producers to be left alone. Now everybody kind of feels like, because they have an iPhone and they know how to use Photoshop, that they're a cinematographer.
No. Oh man, I mean, I totally get your point. Seabiscuit, that was shot in 2002, right? Released in 2003.
Yeah, I think it was 2001, 2002. We shot in the fall and over. We took a break for Christmas and came back in the spring.
Yeah. Well, I think Seabiscuit is one of your finest films, and you also received an Academy Award nomination for that one. I mean, I feel you also should have received nominations for other films, but you know, the Academy works in mysterious ways. 20 years ago, or over the course of 20 years, so many things have changed for better or worse in terms of filmmaking, in terms of politics, for instance, behind the scenes, and in terms of the technology itself. But I think what you just mentioned is very important, because nowadays everybody has equipment available at a relatively more or less low price or affordable price. And they think, well, you know, I've got an iPhone, all of a sudden I'm a cinematographer. No, I would certainly argue with that.
Well, that would be, so my biggest criticism of young cinematographers is that two things. One of the beauties of going to film school was that every day at USC, there were 5 movies playing every 2 hours. So when I wasn't in class, I was watching movies and they were being projected on the big screen. Number one. Number two, you had to understand the basics of photography, right? Now, I had already come into film school with that because I had a dark room. I had a color dark room. I understood the difference between shooting something at a f2 or a T2, depending on the lens you were using, and a T8, right? I understood how depth of field influences storytelling. I don't know if young cinematographers have had the same kind of rigorous training that I had before I ever got to really shoot my first movie. You know, it was a lot of work to get there. And I was in a unique position where I really understood from A to Z, from when the film was sitting in the can to loading it into the magazine, to running it through the camera, to taking it out of the magazine, putting it back in the can, sending it to the lab, looking at your print and looking at your printer lights, understanding where your exposure was, trying to maintain consistency. This was something that all of my peers and I did in the 80s and 90s that I think made us very, very solid, good technical cameramen. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist today, but that same level of technical knowledge is not as important today as it was in 1987.
Yeah. So many things change, and of course, back then, as you just said, you had to take the film to the lab, and then 24 hours later, you would realize, oh, the film is underexposed, it is overexposed, we made a mistake here. And nowadays, due to technology, you get to see it right away. So major difference there also.
Yeah, and the good part of that is because of the high def monitors, if you're doing shots that are very difficult for your focus puller, you can tell right away whether it's in focus or not, versus having to go back the next day and pick up a shot that might have been slightly soft, right? You know, with Michael Bay, you're doing dolly shots that end up at the minimum focus on a lens. So there's very little depth of field. And, you know, obviously I always had great camera assistants, but every once in a while, even the best person in the world can miss a shot because an actor leans or whatever. Nowadays, you'd see it and you wouldn't have to worry about it because you just do it again. Back in the days of Pearl Harbor, we might have to go back and pick up a close-up of Ben Affleck because it was slightly out of focus from the day before. You know, so that's the positive. Then there's a lot of positives, Michael. I just happen to think that the color of film and the nature of the way film contrast is really beautiful. I think Kodak's color science on their stock 5219 is really perfect. And because film works on, you know, 3 sine wave curves to capture the light, it's not blind, right? Whereas a sensor is blind to certain wavelengths of light, no matter which sensor you use. Some are blind in certain areas. And so the color fidelity is just not quite as uniform as it was on film. That's not up for discussion. That's just the way it is.
I would like to read a small quote. I hope I'll get it right. I spent a week living on an offshore oil rig for the opening sequence in the movie, that being Armageddon. The whole crew was flown out to the oil rig. There's not an insurance company or lawyer in the world today that will let that happen nowadays. Do you recall any other incidents, or could you think of a similar story of something that would never ever fly today and was basically possible 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Well, that's the most extreme. I mean, you know, you load a film crew up on a bunch of Huey helicopters, these old helicopters from Vietnam. We fly out of Galveston for 90 minutes and we land on a working oil platform. We live on the platform. Now, the actors are flying in and out every day, so they come in the morning on a helicopter, but we're living on this oil platform. It's very loud. There's not an oil worker on that platform that has all 10 fingers and 10 toes. It's a very dangerous business. So in what version of the world do you think that Disney would ever say, sure, send 80 people off to this Shell oil rig? It'll be fine. Somebody in management is going to go, wait a minute, we can't take this risk. You know, everything else, I don't know if they were that risky. I mean, obviously, filming the shuttles was not risky. It was fun. Alcatraz wasn't risky. It was just very, very strenuous because, you know, prisons are not meant for people to move around in quickly. So you're walking up and down a lot of stairs. There aren't elevators. People are carrying a lot of gear every day. I don't think I've ever seen my crew so fit after 5 weeks. I mean, everybody just was ripping muscles. But we had a really good time. Although Nicolas Cage called Alcatraz Tetanus World because there was so much rusty metal. I think we all had to get tetanus shots before we went to film there, so that in case we got cut on the rust, we wouldn't get it. We wouldn't get the tetanus virus or the tetanus bacteria. Those kind of things.
Didn't Michael get sick during the shoot of The Rock? I think Jerry Bruckheimer once told story.
Yeah, Michael got the flu, but that wasn't going to stop him. I mean, he sat there in his chair with a down jacket on, sweating with 102 fever, but screaming and yelling, and we got it all done.
Screaming and yelling. Oh man.
Michael has a loud voice. So look, John Lee Hancock feels as though, and Paul Feig feel as though a quiet, calm set creates the best working environment for both the crew and the actors, right? And so does Gary Ross and a lot of other directors. Michael likes this sense of chaos. He feels like if people don't know what's going to happen next, they're going to be more on game and on point. So that's his style of working. I mean, that's why when you were asking about his reputation, see, to me, that's all just background noise. I can read right through it, but he likes that he likes to get people running in circles. Now, he never got me running in circles. I've known him since he was 10. And I know this is kind of an act. And at the end of the day, if Michael had yelled at somebody, he would go up to him at the end of the day and say he was sorry, and with a big smile on his face, and hand the guy a beer, right? This was just his act. And if you gave it back to him, if you yelled right back at him, he was very quiet. I mean, when we were doing the scene with John Spencer on the roof in San Francisco, he was saying something to my camera assistant, who was like a black belt in karate. And he turned to Michael and said, if you say one more thing, if you open your mouth, I'm going to throw you off the roof. And Michael turned to me and said, you got to stop. I said, I can't stop him. He's 6'2". He's a black belt. Maybe don't say anything to him. And from that moment on, Michael and Chris were fine. So if Chris said, hey, Michael, I need another minute, Michael didn't say a word, right? Because Michael knew that if Chris said he needed a minute, he needed a minute. It was like Michael would push people, and if they pushed right back, you were fine, right? But if you didn't, then he would just, he could pick on you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure for certain people, or for many people, it would be an acquired taste to be in that environment. Trevor Rabin, he also co-wrote the score for Armageddon, and he once told me that, whenever Michael said something to him, he would fire right back. When he said, "Oh, Trevor, I dreamt you wrote a good piece of music for once." Well, Michael, I dreamt you directed a good movie, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's Michael. So you just have to, know how to deal with them. And, and obviously I had the great joy of being able to look through these cameras and know that we were making incredible shots. When we had the Oklahoma overturned in that giant tank that Jim Cameron had built in Rosarita Beach, and we have black smoke burning in the background, and I've got Cuba Gooding Jr. in a boat, and we're dollying along the side of the tank, and there's fires everywhere. We've basically sucked all the color out of the scene with all the black smoke. I knew that I was doing something that very few people were ever going to get a chance to do, and probably was never going to get a chance to do again in my lifetime, which was to paint on that large a canvas, right? So that's, you put up with some of the being hurried along and having to listen to what sounds like a guy with a leaf blower because he makes so much noise in the background, because you get to paint on this magnificent canvas, right? You really do. And not only a magnificent canvas, but a guy who also knows how to paint.
Allow me to ask you one more question. If anybody asks you to show them a film that you shot, as he wants to see a standout film in your career, or if a director or producer asks you to give him a show reel of one or two movies because they stand out for a certain reason, be it because it's very showy, quote unquote showy, or very, very, very flashy, or intimate, or low key, what would you tell them, show them?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what if this is a director who's interviewing me. It would depend on what movie we're making. Obviously, um, The Rookie is really dear to my heart, right? And I think it has everything in it, from light and dark to pretty to whatever. I think it shows a wide range of different skill level. I also think Saving Mr. Banks does the same because it takes place in different periods. But, Seabiscuit, I think, is an absolutely beautiful piece of work, as is The Rock. Armageddon is very much like a graphic novel. And Pearl Harbor is a beautiful painting with maybe a story that's not quite as good as the way it looks. In some ways, I think my photography on Pearl Harbor is almost bigger than the movie, and certainly, if we had had a better script, the movie would have been more. The movie was huge; it made a huge amount of money, but I don't find the story that compelling anymore. Right? I never thought the script was brilliant, but I knew that I wasn't going to pass up an opportunity to get to shoot a movie like this.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. I mean, basically, the story is quote unquote simple. It's a love story leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah,
basically. But then again, Titanic is very simple. It's also a love story, and then the ship sinks. So basically,
it's true. I think what happens is when you make a movie about the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor and Ford Island, you're dealing in sacred waters, right? It's not that Titanic wasn't either. So, you're going to be under a lot of scrutiny from a lot of people. I mean, my key grip on that movie, Les Tamita, is from the North Shore of Hawaii. His mom was there when the Japanese invaded, right? So, I mean, that's how tied in things were with us on that movie. His mother remembers the planes flying in and bombing Pearl Harbor. Wow. So, again, we were trying to pay homage to those that were killed in that attack, and also try to tell a story that was going to get an audience to come and see it, because it was not an inexpensive movie to make.
It certainly wasn't. And I'm sure it was a huge undertaking, and I mean the action sequences are just fantastic. I mean the whole attack on Pearl Harbor, I mean, what is that, 40-50 minutes of material, and then there's pause, and then there's the Doolittle plan, and there's a lot going on there after the first 70 or 80 minutes when the attack happens.
Yeah, and look again, how many people get the opportunity to sink 10 ships for the Navy to create artificial reefs, right? I mean, those ships, we blew those ships up. Took 8 weeks to cut parts of them open and rig them with, I think it was 60,000 gallons of fuel and TNT and what they call primer cord, which is like an explosive cutting cord. And we did those in 2 successive days, the same time of day, because obviously it all happened like at 7:30 in the morning, but we shot it in the afternoon because that's when the city of Honolulu allowed us to shut down all the freeways for 20 minutes. And we blew up 6 ships. It took 2 minutes. Then the next day we blew up 4 ships, and it took 2 minutes with 16, 17 cameras. Today that would all be CG.
Sadly, yes.
But it's exciting.
John, is there anything else you would like to add? Anything about a certain director we did not get to talk about? I mean, we didn't talk about Rob Reiner and the bucket list, for instance. So maybe you could elaborate on.
obviously, I'm a huge fan of Rob Reiner's, and the opportunity to work with him was a dream come true. And to get to work with Jack Nicholson and Morgan Freeman, two of my heroes. So the idea of getting to make that movie was great. The thing that happened on that movie, which was really unfortunate, was when Rob originally hired me and pitched to me the idea of the movie, we were going to take a very small film crew and we were going to go to the pyramids. We were going to go all the places that you see, we were actually going to go to, so that it really was their bucket list. And what happened was, this was a case of, okay, they're going to be sitting on top of a foam block and we're going to put a blue screen out there and we're going to paint Cairo into the background. So for me, some of the, I felt like that movie got hurt by the fact that we didn't get to go to those places. If we had really made, because the adventure for Jack and Morgan would have come through, right? If we were really there, it would have been so much more compelling than to try to fake it. And we ended up having to fake it. So I enjoyed every minute of making the movie, and I enjoyed Sean Hayes. But I think the reason why that movie feels a little flat is because we didn't do it the right way. It really would have been better to have said, okay, we're taking a camera. I'm going to both light and operate. We bring a camera assistant, and we're going to fly, and we're going to go to Egypt for a week. And then we're going to fly from Egypt to wherever, Israel. Then we're going to fly to India. And then we're going to fly to Nepal and really go there. Because I think the foregrounds are obviously real because it's the real guys, but the backgrounds don't feel real. And that gets what you were talking about.
Yeah.
A lot of the movies you see now. And I think audiences felt that, right? And it just, because so much of it was about this journey that they were going on together, that the fact the journey just didn't look real hurt the picture.
Was it a budgetary thing, or?
I think it was a combination of budget. I think at the end of the day, both Jack and Rob, I think Morgan was up for it. I think they decided, if we travel, what if we get diarrhea? Or, I think they just decided not to do it, So rather than shooting in the little village of Ez in the south of France, which is gorgeous, we shot in a house in Beverly Hills and put a blue screen out the window as though we were in Ez when they're eating caviar. I just know that if we were in Ez, everything about that scene would have been better, right? And that's a case of, you can't fake a travel movie.
Yeah. Very well put. And John, is there anything else you would like to add?
One of the great jobs in the film business is being a cinematographer. It's a great journey. It requires great responsibility because at the end of the day, when the room goes dark and the images come up, you're completely responsible for those images. Granted, it's a collaboration, sometimes to a great degree and sometimes not to a great degree, depending on the nature of the director. But it's an amazing career. I've had an incredible adventure of doing this in my life. I've gotten to work with amazing directors, amazing actors, amazing crew people, great composers. I mean, I love Thomas Newman is one of the few people that will call me and say, we're scoring at 20th Century Fox, why don't you come by? Right? He's so into the filmmaking process that he will reach out and say to me, you got to come by. I got a full orchestra. You should see this, right? And that doesn't happen all the time. A lot of times it doesn't happen because I'm not in the same city, but he's one who really, I happen to love working with him because he's just the most passionate guy, not only about making a score, and certainly he's great with large orchestras, but just the whole process of making movies, and so is Carter Burwell. These guys, they're a delight. They don't do what I do, but they certainly make what I do better.
I love them both. I love Thomas and Carter. I think they're both lovely people and great composers. Yeah. John, thank you very much for taking so much time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that. And let's talk soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.